Hey everyone! This video will be accompanied by another one that looks at free trade, but there's just too much to put it all into one video. Protectionist policies are policies that create a barrier to foreign-produced goods being sold in your country. Now these barriers can be financial barriers such as tariffs or regulatory barriers up to and including the total ban of the sale of foreign-produced goods in your country. So in this video I'm going to give 5 reasons for protectionist policies and look at what they could look like in practice. So let's dive right in. The first reason a country would implement protectionist policies is to protect domestic industries and preserve jobs. Protectionist policies shield domestic producers from foreign competition so that domestic consumers purchase more domestically produced goods. As a result, jobs are protected and the domestic industry has a chance to grow without external competition. This can be especially important when you're trying to develop a new industry. The protectionist policies allow the domestic industry to establish economies of scale, grow capital, and develop expertise that will eventually allow them to compete with the foreign producers. Now, it can also be used when foreign producers are seen to have some sort of unfair advantage. For instance, lower environmental or labor standards. So the protectionist policies can be seen as a way of leveling the playing field. The risk with using protectionist policies in this way is that the other country could respond with protectionist policies of their own, hurting your exporting industries and resulting in job losses in those exporting industries. The second major reason for protectionist policies is national security reasons. Some goods are considered critical, especially those used in the military. For example, steel, which is an essential good for a lot of the defense industry. The problem with relying on foreign-produced steel is that in the event of a conflict, your access to steel could be cut off. Now, this could be if your steel producer is an enemy country that simply cuts off your access to steel, or even if your steel comes from an ally country that simply has increased their demand for steel in the event of a conflict. And because it takes a lot of time to develop an industry, it can be important to have these protectionist policies in place even during times of relative peace so that you're not scrambling in the event of a crisis. Other critical goods include semiconductors, energy resources, and even things like food and medicine because of the severe consequences should they be cut off. Now, one downside of using protectionist policies in this case is it makes these critical goods more expensive. The third reason, and one that's a hot topic right now, is to correct trade imbalances. Now, it's important to say that trade deficits may or may not be a problem. Some trade deficits can lead to issues with debt, currency depreciation, and employment loss. Protectionist policies can reduce your imports, thereby reducing your trade deficit. Now, the obvious risk here is that if the other country responds with protectionist policies of their own, this would reduce your exports, meaning that the policy could have less of an impact on the trade deficit than you had hoped for. The other problem is that the protectionist policies would lead to an overall less efficient global economy. Fourth, protectionist policies can be put in place to protect strategic and cultural industries. Strategic industries are not necessary for national security, but are very important for economic development. Examples include telecommunications and financial services. Meanwhile, cultural industries includes things like films, literature, and art that are important for national identity, values, and heritage. Protectionist policies ensure that there's a domestic industry for these products, thus ensuring a robustness of cultural industries. Now, do you think countries should protect their cultural industries, or do you think domestic consumers should be free to consume whatever media they want? Let me know down in the comments. Finally, protectionist policies can be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations with other countries. Because your protectionist policies hurt the exporting industries of other countries, it can be something that foreign countries are willing to negotiate on. Now, I'll explore this more in my video looking at free trade. Now that we've gone over the biggest whys for protectionist policies, let's look at the what and the how. Protectionist policies essentially fall into two broad buckets: financial barriers and regulatory barriers. It's important to note also that protectionist policies can be broad, applying to many countries and many industries, or targeted, targeting specific countries and specific industries. No matter if it's broad or targeted, protectionist policies work through the same fundamental principles. Now, let's start by looking at financial barriers. Perhaps the most well-known protectionist policy, at least right now, is tariffs. Now, there's actually two different kinds of tariffs: import tariffs and export tariffs. But either one works the exact same as any other tax. So let's look at a classic supply and demand graph to see how this works. In this graph, I have identified domestically produced goods in the lighter purple and foreign produced goods in the darker purple. This is the situation without tariffs, and the blue dot here is the equilibrium point that gives us our price and quantity. Remember that the supply line represents the minimum price that suppliers would need to receive to make supplying the good worthwhile for them. If there's a tariff on them, they would now need the buyers to pay their minimum amount plus the amount of the tax. So we can add the size of the tariff to the foreign goods like this. Now, we have to reorder the suppliers from lowest price on the left of the graph to highest on the right. Doing that, we have our new supply curve. And since the demand curve doesn't change, we can see how the situation has changed from before. The blue dot represents the pre-tariff equilibrium point, but the equilibrium point with the tariffs is, as always, where the demand and supply curves meet. So we see that first, the tariff lowers the price that foreign sellers receive, because they receive the new price minus the tariff, which is the size of the red portion on the chart. Secondly, they raise the price that buyers pay and the price that domestic sellers receive. Third, it lowers the quantity of overall sales in the market, but, and it's hard to see it quickly, but it is there, domestic sales increase. Fourth, it generates a tax revenue to the government. That's the red that's to the left of the equilibrium point. And finally, it also does create an excess burden. That is, it lowers overall economic activity by more than the tax revenue it creates. In the case of tariffs, the higher prices that consumers have to pay is more costly than the benefit to the domestic industries and the tax revenue combined. Another financial barrier that can be implemented is actually subsidies to domestic industries. It may not be obvious at first why this is a protectionist policy, but it's because it has ultimately the same effect as a tariff does, but rather than making foreign produced goods more expensive, it does the opposite and makes domestically produced goods less expensive. So let's again go back to a supply and demand graph to see how this works in practice. So again, looking at the same supply and demand graph, with a subsidy, the domestically produced goods would have a lower minimum price, which we can represent on the graph again here. And so their lower minimum price would require us to, again, reorder the suppliers from least expensive on the left to most expensive on the right to get our new situation. The subsidy, as you can see, would have the opposite effect of the tax. The amount that buyers have to pay, the buyer price, would be lower. The price that foreign producers receive would be lower. The price that domestic producers would receive would be higher because it would be the new price plus the subsidy that they receive. There would be no tax revenue, but there would be a expense that the government has in paying the subsidy. But there would still be an excess burden because the cost of raising the money lowers economic activity by more than the subsidy increases it by. Now let's turn to looking at regulatory barriers, starting with quotas. A quota is just a limit on the amount of a particular good that can be imported or exported over a given period, typically a year. The most extreme example of a quota would be when the limit is set to 0. This would essentially mean banning the import or export of a particular good. Now, the effect of a quota would be very similar to a tariff, but rather than working through the price axis of a supply and demand graph, it would work through the quantity axis of a supply and demand graph. So let's turn to the graph to see exactly how this would work. So again, starting with the same supply and demand graph as always, we're going to look at a situation where there is a total ban on importing the foreign good. So in this case, rather than simply altering the shape of it, what we would have to do is remove the foreign producers entirely from the supply curve. So when we do that, again, we would shift the domestic producers to the left to fill in these new gaps and see our new equilibrium. Again, like with the tariff, we see that the price that buyers have to pay is higher, but the price that the domestic producers receive is also higher. There is a reduction in the overall quantity of sales in the market, and there is an excess burden. That is, the producers benefit less than the consumers lose. Now, the one thing that isn't here, that is in the case of a tariff, is a tax revenue. Because there's no tax, there's no tax revenue. Finally, one more regulatory barrier: import licensing. Import licensing requires anyone who wants to import goods into your country to be licensed by you. Now, in practice, this can look a lot like a quota, but it's a bit more complex. For instance, you can require that companies meet certain standards in order to get these import licenses. For instance, requiring them to meet certain labor or environmental standards that you've set for your own domestic producers. This prohibits foreign countries from being able to outcompete your domestic producers by cutting corners in these areas. Now, this can also be used to pressure these foreign companies to adopt these higher standards. Now, the effect in practice can be big or small depending on the importance of your domestic consumers to those foreign goods. So the bigger you are, the more of an impact you're likely to have. But so there you have it, 5 reasons for protectionist policies and what those policies could look like: tariffs, domestic subsidies, quotas, or import licenses. As I mentioned, I will do another video that looks at free trade, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that video. And if you enjoyed this one, please like the video and share it with your friends, and I will see you in the next one.